Edmonton should not feel this big. It is North America's northernmost metropolitan area with more than 1 million people. And between July 2024 and July 2025, it added just over 50,000 residents.
More than 187,000 people have moved here since 2021,
making it the fastest growing big metro area in Canada. Which is strange, because this is a city where winter temperatures can fall below -40, and where tens of millions are spent every year just keeping snow and ice from choking daily life.
It's terrible for people, like you're driving side by side and so, like you're just waiting for an accident actually.
So how did a place this remote, this cold, and this far north turn into one of Canada's biggest urban success stories? When European fur traders first arrived in the late 18th century and were looking for where to build a trading post in the vast interior of Western Canada, they had an almost impossible problem. The land north and west of the Great Lakes was enormous, largely unmapped, and extraordinarily difficult to move through. Rivers were the only viable routes, and the traders quickly learned something the Cree, one of the major indigenous peoples of this region, had known for at least 3,000 years. One particular stretch of the riverbank was more valuable than almost anywhere else on the continent. The Cree called the area Amisquaskahigan, meaning Beaver Hills House. And what made it remarkable was its position. The North Saskatchewan River connected east to west across the continent's midsection, and it sat at the junction of two enormous drainage systems. Follow one set of waterways south, and you reach the settled territories of eastern Canada. Follow the Athabasca River north from this same spot, and you eventually reach the Arctic Ocean. For anyone trying to organize the movement of goods across the northern interior, this was the one place you had to be. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, two fur trading rivals, both understood this. Fort Edmonton was established in 1795, and it was relocated 4 times over the following decades as flooding and exhausted resources forced the settlement to move. What never changed was the logic of the position. You could move the fort, but you could not move the geography. When Alberta became a province in 1905, Edmonton won the contest to become its capital over Calgary in a rivalry that had as much to do with geography as politics. The city that controlled the northern routes had an argument for centrality that the southern alternative could not match. When gold was discovered in the Yukon in 1897, and thousands of prospectors began flooding northward, Edmonton marketed itself as the gateway to the Klondike, the last supply point before the wilderness swallowed you whole. It was an aggressive piece of boosterism that was not entirely honest about the difficulty of the route, and most of those prospectors never made it to the goldfields because the overland journey was brutal, and many turned back long before they got close. But the hotels, outfitters, and supply businesses that had sprung up to serve them stayed. Edmonton had learned something that would define it for the next century. Its geography was not a resource in itself, but it was the reason every other resource had to pass through here first. Today, the North Saskatchewan River Valley forms one of the largest and most continuous urban parkland systems in North America, stretching 48 kilometers through the city and covering around 7,400 hectares, roughly 22 times the size of Central Park. The valley that once served as the continent's interior highway now runs as a greenway through the heart of a major city. But the more consequential thing that passed through Edmonton was not gold rush supplies. It was something found underground decades later on the 134th attempt. On February 13, 1947, a drilling crew working 15 kilometers west of Edmonton ignited a gas flare that burned against the winter sky. This was Leduc No. 1, and it was the 134th well Imperial Oil had drilled across the Alberta prairies. The previous 133 had all come up dry, and what the crew found that afternoon was that the well had punched into a geological formation that turned out to be one of a long chain of similar structures running beneath the Alberta interior, and the discoveries that followed transformed Alberta from a debt-laden province, one that had defaulted on its bonds during the Depression, into one of the wealthiest jurisdictions in Canada within a single generation. For Edmonton, that timing was everything. The city was already the logistics hub of the northern interior, the place where supply chains terminated and infrastructure concentrated. When the oil industry needed refineries, pipelines, engineering firms, and equipment suppliers, it built them where the workers were and where the routes already ran. The nickname Oil Capital of Canada was a description of a function Edmonton had been performing since the fur trade, now applied to an industry worth way much more. Northeast of the city, a 582 square kilometer industrial zone grew into Canada's largest hydrocarbon processing region, hosting more than 40 companies and tens of billions of dollars in capital investment. This region is where bitumen, the heavy tar-like crude extracted from the Athabasca oil sands, hundreds of kilometers to the north, gets converted into something that can actually move through a pipeline. A huge share of Alberta's oil sands upgrading and processing is concentrated in this corridor. Viewed from the air, it looks less like a city's industrial edge and more like a small civilization built entirely around turning one substance into another. And it exists where it does for the same reason Fort Edmonton existed where it did, because Edmonton was already the place where everything had to pass through. The oil economy shaped what Edmonton became. The work drew engineers, tradespeople, and entrepreneurs willing to tolerate conditions that would send most people elsewhere, in exchange for wages that would also be hard to find elsewhere. A booming city attracts a specific personality, people who come to build something and end up staying because the opportunity keeps renewing itself. Edmonton still tends relatively young for a major Canadian city, with a median age of just under 37. It is young in the way that cities built on extraction tend to be, with a high proportion of people who arrived from somewhere else within the last decade, and a transience baked into the culture that sits alongside a genuine civic pride. But 1 million people drawn by oil need somewhere to live, and the land around Edmonton offered an answer that no other major city in North America could quite match. In every direction from Edmonton's city center, Aspen Parkland stretches across gently rolling terrain with no mountains, coastline, or geographic features that would stop a developer with a bulldozer and a subdivision plan. For decades, the answer to growth was simply to keep going, and the result is one of the most horizontally spread out cities on the continent. Edmonton's population density is only about 1,320 people per square kilometer. Vancouver's is closer to 5,750, and even Winnipeg comes in higher. If you place the island of Manhattan inside Edmonton's city limits, you could fit it 11 times over and still have room left. The city has expanded its boundaries repeatedly through annexation to secure its tax base, including a 2019 annexation of 8,260 hectares to the south. And every time the boundary grows, so does the bill. More roads, more water mains, more sewer lines, more of everything needed to connect distant neighborhoods to the core. A city of this footprint costs significantly more per resident to maintain than a denser one, a calculation that Edmonton has been running for decades and has not yet fully resolved. A family in a southern suburb and a resident of the riverfront neighborhoods near the city center live in the same city on paper, but experience something close to different ones in practice. The distances are large enough that the vast majority of daily trips remain car dependent, which tends to decide where businesses locate, families settle, and what daily life feels like across the urban area. The most visible sign that this pattern may be shifting came in the downtown core, where the ice district rose over what had been parking lots and old rail-adjacent land, built around a new arena and turned into one of the biggest redevelopment projects the city has seen in decades. In a city that spent decades building outward and rarely looking back, it suggests that even with infinite room to expand, something is pulling people back toward the center. Whether that impulse outlasts the economics of sprawl remains genuinely uncertain, but it is worth noting that the people choosing to move back toward the center are doing so in a city where, for several months of the year, Going outside at all requires a level of preparation that most North American cities have never had to think about. In June, Edmonton gets 17 hours of daylight. The sun barely sets before it starts to rise again. Patios fill up at 10 at night, and the river valley trails stay busy well past midnight. The summers here have a quality of sustained brightness that people who grew up further south find disorienting the first time they experience it, and residents describe them as the payoff for everything that comes before them, and what comes before them is winter. Edmonton's winters are not the politely cold winters of most Canadian cities. When the temperature drops below -30, the question is no longer whether you want to go outside, but whether your car will start, and whether the route between you and wherever you need to be has been cleared and treated. The city spends about $67 million every year on snow and ice control alone, a budget that reflects a collective decision made over more than a century of settlement that this climate would not be allowed to determine what the city could or could not become. Part of how Edmonton keeps functioning through the coldest months is underground. The downtown core has a 13-kilometer network of climate-controlled tunnels and elevated walkways connecting more than 40 buildings and transit stations, making it possible to move through a substantial portion of the city center without stepping outside at all. For people who work downtown, this network is the difference between a viable commute and a dangerous one on the days when the temperature falls far enough that the air itself becomes a hazard. In 2012, the city went further, launching what it called the Winter City Strategy, a formal commitment to stop treating winter as something to endure and start designing around it instead. New guidelines focused on blocking wind using evergreen plantings and stepping back building facades to maximize sunlight on the streets below. Techniques that can make an outdoor space feel up to 10 degrees warmer without any mechanical heating. The city also happens to be the second sunniest in Canada during winter, with 121 sun-filled days between November and March. The darkness most people picture when they think of a subarctic city is, for much of the season, not the problem. The cold is, and Edmonton has spent more than a decade deciding that the answer is to design around it rather than apologize for it. Edmonton grew into a metropolitan region of nearly 1.7 million people through a sequence of contingencies that no planner could have designed. A river that happened to sit at the junction of two continental drainage systems, an oil well that happened to come in on the 134th attempt. Flatland stretching to the horizon in every direction that happened to make expansion cheaper here than almost anywhere else on the continent. None of those things were chosen or planned, and Edmonton built on top of all of them for 2 centuries. The city is now trying to figure out what comes next when the inheritance is no longer enough. It is investing in hydrogen energy and biotechnology and an inland port project built on the same geographic logic that made the fur trade viable in 1795. The North still begins here. The question is whether that is still sufficient reason for 50,000 people a year to keep showing up.